Okay, so let's talk about some design movements and some basic typography. Um, this really isn't a design history course, but we want to touch on some historical movements and trends here. So we're going to talk about a few design movements, specifically Art Nouveau, Modernism, and Postmodernism. So I'd like for you to think about them not just as visual looks or styles, but these design movements, they were organized around specific ideas. They were reactions to their cultures and founded specifically on aesthetics and belief systems. But before we really delve into these movements, the first movement really happened when the first printing press was created. But before that, before the Industrial Revolution, what was life really like? We need to look back at that. Well, first of all, nothing was mass produced. Books were hand printed, which took forever. If you could even find the specific, vellum paper or the parchment or whatever that you were looking for, which were sometimes hard to find. Artisans created everything by hand, furniture, jewelry, tools, etc. Only 10% of the European population worked in villages. Most of them, the rest of them farmed land. Um, Now, the printing press was invented by Johann Gutenberg. The earliest example of printing was believed to be around 1453. He was born in Mainz, Germany around 1397, and his work life was really, he worked as a merchant, and then he moved into work as a blacksmith and goldsmith. So he was familiar with the craft of goldsmith and die making. Mainz was the main cultural and commercial center. And during the Renaissance, there was this thirst for knowledge that, traditional handwritten manuscripts really couldn't satisfy anymore. So those manuscripts that were handwritten, they were made to order, typically expensive, very labor intensive, and scribes would copy from another book or had someone read to them. And this led to many errors that were hard to correct. So adding to the expense was the scarcity and the high cost of those papers that I was talking about, vellum and parchment. He created letter forms that resemble handwritten manuscripts. He chose the Gothic manuscript because that was the writing style of local scripts at the time. He first printed a 42-line Latin Bible around 1455. And that Bible consisted of 2 volumes with a total of 1,286 pages. 180 copies of the book were printed, and today only about 48 of them are known to exist. But that led off the whole, really the first of design movements that ever existed. And the first design movement really was Art Nouveau. I mean, it really occurred between the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And so when we look at these images, what do we see? We want to ask ourselves some questions. What do the images convey? What ideas do they express? So how are the following images similar or different? The arts and crafts movement was a reaction to the industrial world and the way in which it was perceived to dehumanize workers. So arts and crafts stress the humanity and the dignity in labor, emphasizing craftsmanship. So in doing this, the movement looked back to the Renaissance and medieval design. So the belief was that the previous masters had all discovered the significant forms. So they were just going to recreate them. So we see, very organic, decorative style. We see these images based on nature or natural forms, natural light, sweeping curves and loose flowing letter forms. That's what Art Nouveau was all about. And if you look at the GE logo, it was created in 1890. It was actually, the initial phase of the modern movement. And if you look at this logo, it's extremely Art Nouveau. It replaced, it's when innovation really began in terms of replacing historicism. And this logo hasn't changed at all. So when we hit modernism, modernists felt like the traditional forms of art and architecture and literature and religious faith, social organization and daily life, those were becoming outdated in the new economic and social and political conditions of a emerging full industrialized world. So authority ruled. There was this rigid attention to structure. There was a questioning of the views of the previous traditional age. The power of human beings to create, improve, and reshape their environment with the age of practical experimentation, scientific knowledge or technology, which was at the very, very beginning. And the idea of truth is objective, simply that, no matter what we believe to be the case, some things will always be true and some things will always be false. So if we look at some modern movements, we can still apply the same questions. What do we see? What do the images convey? What ideas do they express? So how does this differ from Art Nouveau? The sweeping letter forms went to very emphasize pure geometry. It stressed clean, functional forms. The Bauhaus concept influenced, by earlier design movements. It bridged the gap between fine and applied arts. It emphasized that functional graphic design. If you've ever heard the term form follows function, that came from the Bauhaus movement. So there was this belief that design principles should be founded rationally. So you can see in these examples the pure geometry that we're talking about, even in some of the typefaces. If we look at this universal alphabet here, why would we consider this universal font a Bauhaus font? It's that pure geometry in place. And this, movement crossed over into other parts of design, including industrial design. If you look at any of the modern furniture, especially modular furniture that we see today, it's all influenced by Bauhaus movement. And architecture as well. This is the actual Bauhaus school, which looks very geometric in itself in the architecture. And this is all post-World War I. And then, once we get post-World War II, we started seeing the Swiss style, the international Swiss style, and Helvetica, and the bold sans serif typefaces. This was a graphic design style developed in Switzerland in the late 50s, so it emphasized cleanliness, readability, use of grid, and like I said, sans serif typefaces. So Max Mettinger, Edward Hoffman, they invented Helvetica, and it was widely used by Swiss, as a Swiss typeface for a long time. It was developed in 1957. It's a neo-grotesque or realist design, one influenced by the famous 19th century typeface, the Axizens. It's hard to say that word, grotesque. Another German and Swiss design. So if we look at these posters, we can see that influence. And of course, as we lead into postmodernism, we started seeing a challenge in the line between high and low culture, blurring the distinctions between fact and fiction or art and commerce. So again, we started rebelling against the previous age. We started seeing a wild juxtaposition of old and new cultural styles. So there was a lot of diversity and fragmentation. We rejected that rational thought was the answer to every social problem. Um, and we also embraced the paradox. Like, for instance, if you've ever seen Jurassic Park, it casted doubts about modern science, but it depended on technological wizardry to execute its message. So, here, we see in postmodernism design, this is a poster by Paula Scher for the Public Theater in New York. Um, and you can see this opposition to hierarchy, this emphasize diversity and fragmentation here. There's still order and structure, but we started seeing a lot more like handwritten type text and a lesser use of a grid in design work. So if we look at postmodern and modern in the modern television, in the media, we've got the Situation Room versus postmodern Daily Show. If we look at science fiction, Star Trek would be the modernistic version, and then postmodern would be Star Wars.